I've always told myself that as a moderately kinky person, I wanted to be able to keep my kinks below a level where when I introduce them to a new partner, they're at least 80% likely not to immediately block me on Facebook or flee my apartment. And I think I did a pretty good job of this until the winter of 2011 when I met a deliciously twisted young woman that I will affectionately refer to as the turbo sled. And I say this with admiration and also to protect her identity. Now, the turbo slut was a remarkable young woman. She was absolutely beautiful with thick, long brown hair, bright blue eyes, and the rather amazing ability to orgasm from the slightest stimulation and then continuously orgasm thereafter. We actually never found a limit to that. We would joke that she was the National Slut Reserve, which would be kind of like a superhero force that you would mobilize when the American libido had finally collapsed under the weight of Kirkland's signature tater tots. I picked Turbo Slut up from work at 9:30 p.m., and we had a couple stops to make on the way home. Our first stop was Union Jack Strip Club, where I paid two strippers $40 a piece to pull her hair and bite her while we listened to Nine Inch Nails and Aerosmith. And then our next stop was Fred Meyer's for supplies, which consisted of 2 bottles of Prosecco, 3 bars of chocolate, a 50-count pack of clothespins, a roll of duct tape, a 12-count box of condoms, and 1 bottle of Columbia Gorge organic tangerine juice. And this was in addition to the riding crop, flogger, dressage whip, butt plugs, rope, vibrator, lube, and unopened box of 100-count nitrile examination gloves that we already had in the car. Because it's important to be prepared for any romantic contingency. Now, if you live here in Portland, you know that Portland is not a cheap city to live in. And if you work in the service industry, you know that home can be a rather creative concept. And in Turbo Slut's case, home was actually a detached garage, which isn't nearly as forlorn as it sounds. It was actually quite nice with red American clay plastered walls and rough sawn fir rafters. And it was inconvenient in that it didn't have a sink or a bathroom or a kitchen, but it was actually kind of a good setup for us, mostly because of all the screaming. So I don't want to get into too much graphic detail of exactly what we were up to that night, but just to kind of paint a picture in your mind, about an hour later, Turbo Slut was down on her knees with her hands tied behind her back, and I had both of my hands wrapped in her hair, and I was just throat fucking the living shit out of her. And it was blisteringly erotic, but because I'm a gentleman, and also because I've always assumed that human beings need oxygen to survive, about every 60 seconds or so, I would pry her off of my cock, and she would look up at me with drool just pouring out of her mouth and down over her tits and stomach. And I would say, are you okay? And she would reply, if you keep stopping, you're going to ruin this experience for me. Which is also extremely hot, but does place one in the quandary of wanting to be the best possible lover while not asphyxiating the person you're making love to. Fast forward 3 hours, and we've been fucking and fucking and fucking and doing all manner of unspeakable things, probably violating the sex laws of at least half the states in the union. And I don't remember exactly how we finished, but I remember there was just this sublime moment where I blew my load all over her, and I fell back onto my heels with just sweat pouring off of my body. And I felt exactly like Brad Pitt in that scene in Fight Club. you, you know the one with the dish gloves and Helena Bonham Carter disheveled in the background? And it was like my whole being was just suffused with exaltation. And then I passed out. The next morning, I wake up and I wave my arms because the room has this fancy motion-activated lighting, which comes on very slowly, which my head is very grateful for. And I look around and it's a scene of just utter debauchery. There's like 2 empty champagne bottles on their sides and a rope hanging from one of the rafters and a pair of handcuffs kind of half draped off a chair and the Hitachi vibrator is still plugged into the wall. And my computer's paused on a porn video, and it just looks like someone has locked Jackson Pollock in a she-bop store overnight with a fifth of Jack Daniels. It was as though if we were suddenly buried in volcanic ash and future archaeologists just happened to excavate us first, they would find evidence of some strange bacchanalian rituals that people apparently practiced in small temples adjacent to their main homes. And I had this feeling in my mouth, you know, that feeling that you get when you've had nothing to drink but alcohol for 7 hours and then slept for 5, like your tongue is too big and you have to slowly peel it away from the Sahara Desert of your upper palate. And thirst on that scale is kind of a medical emergency. And so I'm looking around the room in desperation, and like an oasis, I see that bottle of Columbia Gorge organic tangerine juice sitting right next to a half-eaten bar of chocolate, and I just grab it and I start chugging. And when you're not quite awake and also kind of hungover, it takes longer than you might expect to realize that something that you're drinking doesn't taste exactly like it should. And so it wasn't until the 3rd chug that I started thinking, something maybe is off with the tangerine juice, but it wasn't until the 4th deep swallow that suddenly a vision came flooding back to me from the night before. It turns out that congratulating myself for being the kinky Wilt Chamberlain was not the last thing I had done before going to bed the night before. The last thing I had done was drink an entire bottle of Columbia Gorge organic tangerine juice, and then, because there was no bathroom, proceeded to refill it with my own urine. Now, I've never been able to puke, not once in my entire life, so I knew that wasn't coming back up. And so I'm getting dressed very quickly and telling myself it's just pee, it's just pee, it's just pee, as I'm scurrying across the alley to the main house and just hoping as I enter the kitchen area that there isn't somebody there wanting to make breakfast conversation as I run to the bathroom. And Turbo Slut's already in there taking a shower, where I begin what can only be described as tryouts for the toothbrushing Olympics. And I am brushing like a motherfucker. And it's like that scene in Pee-wee's Big Adventure with the foam and the growling. And it's just not working. And suddenly I get this flash of insight. It's actually an environmental slogan from the 1970s. The solution to pollution is dilution. And with that, I jam my whole head under the faucet and start basically inhaling water. And I'm just so intent on trying to dilute and somehow transmute the molecules of urine inside of me into something else that I don't hear the shower turn off. And suddenly there's just kind of this awkward silence. And I look up sheepishly and she's looking at me like, what the fuck? And I say, remember that bottle of tangerine juice that I peed in before I went to bed? And that was all it took. And she was like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. Oh no. Oh my God, no. And then there's this next kind of silence, and then she says, I'm not gonna kiss you good morning. So I don't know exactly how you're supposed to celebrate having just drank 10 ounces of your own urine, but I do remember thinking to myself that when I first started getting involved in more adventurous forms of sexuality, there were always those things that you would look at and say, oh, I would never do that. And that being whatever it was that squicks you out at the time. But like everything, sexuality exists on a continuum. And at some point, if you do anything long enough, you're going to have that moment where you look at yourself and your surroundings and your activities and you realize, oh my God, I've become a complete pervert. And it was at that moment that I realized that I had become one of those people, the people who drink pee.